Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I'm your host, Dave Markle, coming to you from the Long Valley Studio in Washington, Utah. Most of you already know the foundation of this podcast, but for those of you who are new here, I want you to know that this show serves a dual purpose. First, it provides a safe space for victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault to share their experiences to facilitate healing. Secondly, it educates listeners on the principles of a trauma-informed response, going beyond superficial understanding to foster effective advocacy and positive action. This is episode 139, and returning as my guest this week is Nicole Florisi. It's truly an honor to have her back on the show. She's going to bring us up to date on what's happening with the ongoing issues at the women's shelter where Nicole used to serve as the executive director. And we also discuss some of the ongoing problems with trauma-informed education, training, and implementation in the criminal justice and advocacy fields. This episode is meaningful and important for everyone, so let's get to it. Here's Nicole. Hey everyone, I'm back with Nicole Florisi. It's been a while since she's been in studio with me. Nicole, thank you for joining me, especially today. This is Memorial Day weekend, and she's agreed to come on with me and give us an update. Hi, Nicole.
Hello, thank you for having me on again. I always love coming to your show, so I'm very appreciative.
Well, thank you. And I have to even say, last time we recorded, you said some very nice things about this show and the platform that it offers to victims and survivors. So I appreciate you. It's an honor to have you back.
Well, you have some fantastic people who come on your show, and hearing survivors be willing to share their stories helps other people be strong, and they have somebody to look at. What I think it helps people move forward from. I think being a victim is a personal choice. That's my philosophy. A person can be a victim of a crime, but victimhood can become a choice or a lifestyle, unfortunately, to include interpersonal victimhood. But I think what your show does is it can provide the platform for the people, one, to share their story, and there is power in that. You can take power when you are the narrative, but then it gives power to other people to hear that, one, to know they're not alone, two, to go, hey, if I'm ever ready, I know I have a place to do it. It sometimes can be reassuring. I think it's really important because obviously some of the stuff that your survivors share is absolutely horrifying.
Yeah.
And they're willing to come forward, and this is what happens to people, and this needs to stop, and this perpetual stuff, people need to know about it, because you can't fix anything if nobody's willing to talk about it.
Right, which is why I say let's normalize this conversation. And I think a big part of that is me having the privilege of people feeling safe. And they come on this show and say that. They say, I hear it in your voice. I know what your background is. I know that nothing that I say is going to be turned against me. And that's my internal compass, is to make sure my guests are feeling safe and secure and know that if they tell me after they say something, hey, I don't want that in there, take it out, I honor that.
And then you do.
I edit out whatever they don't want in there.
Again, I just think helps empower people because, as you know from all the work you do in this field, sexual assault, there's no more intrusive thing that can happen to any human being, right? And one of the things that can help a person is that level of control. They have control over something. So even you giving them that opportunity, hey, I said that, I'm not comfortable, can you remove it? That is powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that means a lot to people. And again, I'm just happy to be able to be on your show and be part of the conversation because it's obviously an area that needs more work. It's always going to need more work. There's always going to have to be survivors sharing, and we're not going to be able to put a stop to it, but we sure as heck can bring awareness to it. And like you said, normalize stuff so they don't feel the shame in their experience, right? Because they shouldn't have to carry that among everything else.
Absolutely. That is the whole goal of this platform and this show, is to give people that assurance that they don't have to be alone, they can be safe, and they are helping others in sharing their story by making others aware. And that awareness is amazing. And that's part of why I wanted you back. We're going to go into some follow-up about what our last discussion was, which is another aspect of this whole trauma issue, and that is where that trauma comes from is sometimes institutionally based, unfortunately. For my listeners who may want to go back and listen, I think it's episode 99, if I'm not mistaken, Nicole was talking about a particular place that she used to be the executive director of. Some issues that had been brought to her attention through some clients and former clients. If you could give us an update on what's going on with that particular institution.
So unfortunately, from what my perspective of what good news would be, I don't have any. That person is still in charge of the organization. There's been other things coming to light. I'll just be honest between you and the listeners. I don't understand why the board continues to support that executive director. It's very challenging and heartbreaking. I am very vested in what you were talking about, like institutional betrayal, organizational betrayal, agency betrayal of all sorts. And this is one of those cases that just, you have to be a strong person to continue to go, if I just keep trying, maybe it's going to get better. The last time we had talked, some of the clients had reported basically what you would consider institutional betrayal. There was sewage backup in the location, it wasn't being addressed. So there was like horrifying living conditions. There was belittling and berating of clients. One instance that a particular client talked about to the newspaper, so this is common knowledge. I believe you attached the newspaper article to the original episode.
Yep.
Basically, a client had been accused of something, like one of the staff members had trapped her in a room and was yelling and screaming at her, modeling abuser behavior, those kind of things. And the client that was willing to speak to the newspaper, in my perspective, and this is Nicole talking, everybody here, has been extremely marginalized and continues to be marginalized by all the organizations involved. So she's strong enough to go to the paper, and then that institution itself basically calls her a liar. The executive director had a meeting that an unknown person recorded, and the executive director violated client confidentiality in that meeting. And there's recording of it and affidavits from individuals who were present in the meeting. And that client has a copy of that conversation and was encouraged to provide it to VOCA, who administers the federal grant funding through the state, through the Department of Public Safety. They're not going to share with me what they did.
Right.
I can only tell you what I've heard, which is a baby slap on the wrist for a violation of federal law. And they were given as an organization retraining in confidentiality. Well, it's not the organization, it's a particular person who violated it and knowingly violated it and says it. And in fact, I have that recording and could probably give it to you if you'd like to put it on your show.
That's crazy, isn't it, though?
It blows my mind.
Little was done.
We are honor bound. It is an absolute obligation and responsibility to protect clients, even if they've offended you, even if they've hurt you, even if they make you uncomfortable or scared or any of those what we consider negative emotions. You have the obligation in that role. You have chosen to be an advocate. You have chosen to be a voice for the voiceless.
Right.
And then you're going to become someone who marginalizes clients. And that is just completely asinine. And it's really unforgivable. It's unforgivable. And what do you do when the organizations now know and then don't do anything?
Right. Right.
Don't do anything, at least I should say, because I guess retraining is something, if that is a true statement, because that's just what I've heard through the grapevine. VOCA's not going to tell me what they did. You know, this is where I wish I had, like, if you want to say unlimited funds at my disposal of just random money. Because, Guy, you know, we were, you know, there was a group of us who, even at the time when she was removed from the shelter, when it was inappropriately removed from the shelter and kicked out with her grandkids, a lot of us were donating to a private fund to get her a hotel room, get her food, get her like what she needed. She was just removed arbitrarily, and basically think of a grandma taking care of grandkids with nowhere to go. We are honor bound to do something with that. And then the continuous marginalization, honestly, it just blows my mind. And don't get me wrong, I'm not naive. I know it happens. You know it happens. Probably your listeners are well aware, and some of your listeners being survivors have experienced it from institutions, right?
Yeah, I've had some of them come on and say that. Yeah.
Right. But the part of me that's like, hey, wholesome, like, what are we doing? It's so offensive. It's so offensive to me.
It is.
I've loosely reached out to ABC down here in the Valley and said, I have it. I would think they would want to run with that and expose it. But I'll tell you, nobody's gotten back to me so far.
Wow.
And I'm like, I have the file. I have paperwork. I have everything. The client said she was willing to talk. And I personally, just so you know, like, I've never talked to this client. Nicole, to this client, I've never talked to her. The intermediate person said she'd be willing to chat with whomever about whatever. So the only place I know for sure the recording has gone is to DPS, who is basically metering all the VOCA funds through the grant.
And to your knowledge, as you've mentioned, nothing other than that mini reprimand has happened.
Yeah, if the reprimand is even referenced that, if that is actually true. Because the thing is, you know, I mean, I guess at this point I could probably do a FOIA request and do as best I could to get the information. I just heard from a trusted source that re-education is being done on client confidentiality at the organization. I reached out to the Attorney General I did hear back from the Attorney General personally. I did hear back from DES, not so much from VOCA, but the Attorney General, and I get this because obviously being a police officer as well,
Right.
I can't make third party, what you call complaints for victims for them to get help. They really need to talk to the victims directly.
Correct.
But as we talked about prior, not everybody's ready to come forward. And that's a big ask of somebody who's already struggling to report to agencies about those type of things. And maybe where they don't feel safe and maybe where they're not sure that they're really going to be heard. So the Attorney General, it's not that they weren't open, but I knew when I reported this, I can't report for somebody else or multiple somebody else's. And even though I've encouraged people to talk, they got to be ready to do that.
Yep.
They have to be ready for themselves. And like we talked about in the last episode, I just think, to me, that's almost an unreasonable ask of a survivor.
It's really tough. For the listeners who aren't aware, the Attorney General's office would be the law enforcement end of this violation of federal law of saying things on this recorded interview that they weren't supposed to say, they weren't supposed to disclose. So there is some crime that has occurred that the Attorney General's office could look into prosecuting if they
and perhaps
had
if
enough
that client reaches directly out to the Attorney General, and I don't know, I cannot answer that as of right now, if they've reached out to the Attorney General instead of like VOCA through DPS, Department of Public Safety,
right.
Maybe she would have some recourse, and that might be the way to go. I don't know if anybody has encouraged her to do that, and perhaps they will. I can only imagine being in that type of situation where, because she did talk to DES, Department of Economic Security, who meters additional funding, and she's talked to VOCA, and then to feel like you have not had anything positive happen. Are you really going to want to talk to the Attorney General at this point? To what? Be told your complaints don't matter? I'm not saying the Attorney General will always do that. That's not what I'm saying they would do.
No.
But like you're already doing what people have asked of you to report these things, and you keep getting shut down. At some point, you probably go, why am I wasting my energy?
Yeah. Tell the listening audience that may not know what the VOCA Act is and how that interplays with all of this.
The VOCA Act basically it was passed, and you're going to forgive me, I don't remember the year it was passed, but
it's old.
It kind of meters.
It's pretty old. It's been decades that VOCA has existed.
Right.
So
and I can send some information for your listeners to look at, some links and everything like that. I'm happy to do that. It's the Victim of Crime Act. And so people who experience domestic violence and are victims or survivors of that, they have some protections under that.
Right.
And breaking those, for example, can be a violation of federal law. There's some state law that can mirror some of that. So people not knowing my background, I am still a police officer in Arizona. I have worked as a therapist in the past, and currently I'm a law enforcement trainer. So I have a broad scope of what I do. But while I was the executive director of one of these organizations, let me give you an example that sometimes is just education. So if the police show up at what we would consider a domestic violence protected shelter, they're not allowed to just arbitrarily come in. We cannot, not any staff member to include the executive director, we cannot say that there is a specific client there, even as goofy as it sounds, right? Even if the client just called the police themselves and said, I want you to respond. If they haven't stepped outside the bounds of the property and waiting for the officer, and the officer is like, hey, I'm here to see so-and-so, they just called me. No, we can't do that. And some of it's education, because officers would be super pissed. Yeah. One of the things I was very focused on, we didn't have a great relationship with law enforcement prior to when I took over that organization. And I thought it was more, hey, this is just an education piece. Police need to be educated on what they are allowed to do. VOCA also, there's some protections about like SANE kits with or without police involvement, evidentiary considerations if somebody wants a SANE exam, but they don't want the police, reporting requirements when it comes to sexual assault, ages of 18 or over, and amongst other crimes, right? But there's protections for that. But client confidentiality is a huge concern when it comes to domestic violence, because abusers are out there searching for their person electronically, trying to get a hold of them. Some people do still, and this does happen, are still having some type of contact with their abuser, and that's very common. Yep. They still need help, right? You know what I mean? They're extremely vulnerable as well. So there's some protections with that. But client confidentiality is a really big thing. I was imagining in my mind when this was brought to DPS who meters VOCA, something else maybe a little bit more severe was going to be done.
Would happen.
And if there is, let me just give this disclaimer. If there is something else or more severe, I am completely unaware of it.
Right.
So I could not know, but from what I've heard, that's not the case.
And I think the whole interesting part of this from my perspective and from my listeners' perspective is that the abused clients at this particular institution reached out to you as
Correct.
someone who had been an administrator at that organization before and said, hey, what do we do? The fact that you even got yourself involved and the risks that came out of that are huge. And
They are
I
huge.
think it
And
says,
it's been interesting, Dave, to be honest with you. I mean, the organization through the board reached out to my police department I work for and had something to say about my behavior. I didn't report this as an on duty police officer. I'm also a private citizen.
yes,
And they actually reached out to my work. I don't have a copy of the email. I could probably ask for it and do a FOIA request on it myself and get it, but it wasn't very positive, right? Wasn't positive at all.
right.
There's that. I actually do have a copy of a letter the board sent to some of their donors, basically calling me a liar and saying they were calling my police officer my integrity as a police officer, basically saying I made up the fact. I mean, insinuating, I guess I should say, I made up the fact that this was happening. It was inflated. The email actually says that I didn't report this to any state organization. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought initially when I talked to you, I forwarded you the emails to show you there was a documented record of me reaching out to DES, me reaching out to the Attorney General, me reaching out to VOCA.
I
Not so
know.
much that you could provide that to your lister, but just to be like, hey, there's a paper trail of the things I have
Right,
done.
right. We
And,
talked
call
about
my
that.
integrity. I'm sorry, go ahead, Dave. I
We,
couldn't hear you.
well, we talked about that, but I don't think I ever got the emails. I know I got the article and I published that, but yeah, those emails, the fact, and the point of all this, me bringing this up is to emphasize to my listeners what integrity you have. We've talked about this platform being such a great opportunity for victims and survivors, but I think what you're doing is above and beyond anything, obviously, that you as a police officer, as a former director of this institution, had to involve yourself in, but there's just some personal integrity there and concern about victims and survivors that I think is astounding and commendable. And I just want to bring that out to my listeners about what it is that you're doing that is so amazingly good. And I appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I just wish what I was doing had more impact at this point. So, I mean, here, look at me, a little bit removed, but very vested, right?
Yes.
And I
Yes.
feel like I can accomplish nothing. And then I sit for a second anytime I get frustrated and I go, yeah, but you know what? I'm not the survivor involved, which is why I keep going. This is so much bigger than me. And what frustrates me the most is how people can let this stuff slide. I don't understand. And I'm going to be honest with you, I am never going to understand. There are these power dynamics involved. People, I think, forget because it's on the police side too. We have to acknowledge, like
Hmm.
us, our role as police officers, there's a power dynamic between us and every citizen by nature of being an authority figure and, basically tasked with what? Enforcing the law and being a peacekeeper.
Yep.
But you can't strip away the power dynamic from you or anybody else. Nor can you do that with any individual who works for a domestic violence, SA, or sex trafficking, human trafficking organization, because you have power that they don't. As much as you try and soften that relationship, mitigate that power dynamic, you have a level of control over that person when they're in that environment. And that has to be acknowledged and it has to be respected. That's what's frustrating. This is what I would want everybody to know. And I know your survivors know this. And this sounds kind of harsh, but I need people to understand that most of the time in trauma, there is no gratitude. There's
Yep.
not a love for you as an advocate at that moment.
Right.
People are coming to these shelters, and a lot of time they don't unpack their suitcase. They're sleeping in their clothes with their shoes on. They don't even get under the blanket. Like they're still in this acute stress arousal, what more
Yep.
people would commonly refer to as this like fight or flight mode. They're worried they're going to be found. They're shelter hopping. There can be aggression and
Right.
anger and mood instability. And what I found, especially when I first took over that organization, I'm not saying this term to offend anybody listening to this, but what people are looking for is what I call the perfect victim. And that
Yeah.
is the person who comes into a shelter and they want to clean like the bathroom with a toothbrush and they want to cook and they are very meticulous and their outward expressions of emotion, they're really not there. They're very dampened and they
Yeah.
appear gracious for everything. But that is not trauma. It can be for some people, it manifests differently, but most I don't want to assign like a value to it, but for some people, we all have to acknowledge it is aggression, it is mood instability, it is fearfulness, it is just living on the edge all the time, not being able to come down. That brain, that amygdala is just off the charts, ready to go. Always, that's a fear center, that's a driving behavior of human beings. You can rarely find gratitude in that. People
Right.
aren't going to be thankful for the damn bologna sandwich you just gave them,
Right.
or the roof over their head, or the fact they took a shower. They have to get to a level of feeling safe for gratitude many times to even appear?
Mm-hmm.
Or what about individuals who are survivors but that are also battling addiction problems?
Exactly. You
Or
exacerbate all of what you're talking about with all the
right,
other extraneous stuff that is going on in their life. And that fear of what you just brought up in terms of not knowing when they go into this institution, that some of them are institution hopping, the fear of the unknown. What am I getting into at this place?
right.
Who's going to treat me right? Who's going to not treat me right? What am I going to find in terms of support? And that whole fear factor is just, it amplifies all the stuff you just listed,
Well,
victims and
we're not,
survivors are going through.
I don't think collectively as a society we're where we need to be on trauma informed care. That was
Absolutely.
one of the first things I noticed when I took over this organization, not for lack of people trying. That's not a reflection, but people have their lanes of what they're educated in, what their background is. Obviously, working as a police officer and working sex assaults and stuff like that, you got to get to a level of how you actually build those relationships for people to even hopefully tell you what's going on, to build some kind of trust bridge,
Yep.
even on the police side. And you're well aware of this, how horribly intrusive that happened to somebody. How do you get them to want to share that with you? Knowing everything that's coming, potentially going in front of a judge, a jury, like all of those kind of things, all the mud you get dragged through in the legal process. It's no secret, as you know, the research as well as I do, it's no secret that many sexual assault victims say the worst part of the sexual assault whole entirety is the police interview,
Right.
right? So we've had to come back from that and better practices and do that. So we had to get that as police. Don't imagine the whole world is caught up to where we need to be in trauma informed care. We're not. You've been doing this long enough. Remember when domestic violence and sex assault centers tended to be run in like that militaristic fashion? You will get up at 6 a.m., like you
Very
will do
much
this,
so.
like you will clean, you will get a job, like you will do all these things.
Yep.
A trauma brain can't be that. And when people can do those things is when the brain is settled. I mean, they may go through the motions a little bit, but they're not where they need to be. We're supposed to morph into better practices.
Yeah. So, Nicole, let me bring this up too. You brought it up. You touched on it, is the educational aspect of not only law enforcement, but those who are running these institutions, the administrations, about being trauma informed. And the sad part about all of this is they can be trauma informed, educated, but still not be able to grasp what that means. They don't
100%.
understand what it means to be trauma informed, and they don't change at all, even with the education, even hours, 40 hours, 50 hours of trauma informed education, not being able to grasp what it means, how it has an impact on those that they're dealing with, and what's going on in their own life. They don't even recognize the traumas that they've experienced as being impactful and exuding onto others.
Correct. And you're just talking that multi-layered relationship, right? Because let's be honest, many people who become advocates bring their own trauma to the table in their background because they want to make the world better.
Yes,
But
that's their goal.
people trauma bond for a reason, and that happens in all sorts of facets of life. But you're hitting the nail on the head. There was a lady who worked at the organization where I was at, and when I found this out, I was just absolutely floored. But your listeners, again, they should also be floored with me. She'd been running prior to me getting there. It's like a sex assault group, not like group therapy because she wasn't a therapist, but just like a group where people could get together,
Like
have community.
Yeah, like a moderator for people
right.
to kind of communicate with each other.
And then I find out she says to one of my employees, I don't understand how a man can be raped by a woman. And then how many people have you marginalized and hurt because you don't know? How many people don't want to report their sexual assaults because they've had an orgasm in the middle of it? Because the body does what the body does sometimes, right? Yep. Imagine having to tell that to an investigator or any other human being on this planet and the shame associated with that because your body just did what the body does sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
So imagine how many people have inadvertently, I'm not saying it was purposeful on that person's part, but I know she had education. Education is not training, not in any world. You have to train, and I think this is true in the police world, and I think it's equally true in the advocate world. People cut their interview techniques on the back of victims. They cut their interviewing teeth on the back of victims, and that's absolutely inappropriate and unfair. It's unfair because we harm people in the process of trying to get to be a better interviewer, better advocate, better person, because we don't know how to talk to people. One of the weaknesses I noticed, and again, your male survivors may relate to this, sometimes crisis hotline individuals, or what I noticed was a trend, people are very uncomfortable talking to men about sexual assault versus women. It's so much more common and accepted, but they didn't know what to say to a male survivor. They just didn't know what to say to them. You can say the same things you would say to a female survivor. You are talking to a human being who experienced something horrific. That person's gender shouldn't be the barrier to understanding it happens. A lot of what I did notice is there was just a lack of trauma-informed care in general in the advocacy world. and I don't relate just to my organization, it's just stuff I've seen over time. I'm very vested in it. People are just not treating people, and I would say to you, with what I would consider even just basic human compassion, because you don't agree. Or when people say, you should just leave, people will leave when they can and when they're ready. I remember this was a call as a police officer. I remember this. I did talk to a lady one time on a domestic violence. I always encourage them. There are resources. There are this. We have those conversations because not everybody's ready. But when you are ready, here's what that could look like. Do you want to have your birth certificate, social security card? Do you have separate money? Do you have access to your license? If you have children, what would you need of their paperwork when you're ready to leave? Because leaving and leaving in preparation for anything are two different conversations.
Yep.
But if you're not ready to leave that day, is there anything you can do to help you in the future? And one lady messaged me, this is, I think, the best thing Facebook has ever been, told me, hey, you said something that rattled in my brain 2 years ago to me, Nicole. You said that to me on a DV call. And I want you to know today I left. Today. Yeah. And I was so proud of her.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? Again, that's just a thing I've noticed where sometimes advocates, again, education, not training, right, can't understand why somebody who's being physically, sexually, emotionally, financially abused just doesn't walk out the door, because it's not that simple, because if it were, nobody'd stay.
Right.
I had a couple of my staff tell me one time, well, people who still see their abusers, they don't need our services. I'm like, holy cow, not that I want to put a value on services, but people who are still seeing their abuser, whether it's court ordered for the children or there is a level of control, they also need a lot of help, a lot of help.
Yeah.
I feel like every time I come on your show, we talk about so many topics in so many different ways. I don't even know where to start or end.
Yeah. These perspectives are in some ways, like you've said, shocking that they still exist. I mean, we've been trying to educate law enforcement, advocates, institutions, hospitals, the criminal justice system as a whole for decades. And sometimes doesn't it feel like we're just spinning our wheels?
Oh my gosh. I'm like, are you and I? Because your podcast is so awesome, it's going to be going in like 10 and 15 more years, right? Are you and I going to be having the same conversation in 15 years? I don't want that.
I don't either.
And the thing is, all the negative stuff we talk about, it's not like there aren't organizations doing absolutely great work, right?
Yeah.
Individuals doing fantastic, great work. Part of it's just, I don't want to say it's not enough. It is awesome what they're doing, but I'm saying collectively overall, it's not enough.
Right.
Because there's no reason you and I should even have to have this conversation anymore.
That's absolutely right.
Like law enforcement should be educated, and advocates, and like whether it's nonprofit or for profit, human trafficking, sex trafficking, people should be educated in that. We used to take individuals who were sex trafficked at the location I was at. People forget personalities are different. You can't take somebody who's been sex trafficked and put them in the room with what you would consider a traditional domestic violence victim, or somebody who's been sexually assaulted. Those are two very different personalities. Sometimes, as your listeners know, if you have been involved in sex trafficking, perhaps you might have a little bit more of an aggressive personality because you've had to fight for everything your whole life. You've been put in these situations. That doesn't always mix in the traditional sense with domestic violence or sexual assault who hasn't experienced that. It's like, no, like you have to put people somewhere else where everybody's safe. Like the person who's been trafficked is safe and they don't feel threatened by other people. And then the people who experience, again, I'm just putting under a more traditional umbrella, who haven't experienced sex trafficking, they feel safe. There's just so much. Like, honestly, this is a podcast we could do for like days. Like, about what the weaknesses.
Yeah.
I mean, as hard as we're all trying to shore them up, but like the weaknesses involved in advocacy. And, one of the areas I think that advocates suffer the most is I feel they don't actually get recognized for all their vicarious and secondary trauma.
Yeah.
Nobody's attending to them. Right. And they're bringing that. They're doing a lot with that, and it's usually not healthy.
Yeah. And
there's not enough conversation about that.
Yeah. We've talked about that before. And I think one of the important things for the listeners to hear at this point is that this kind of trauma is multi-layered, but all of it changes the brain. But it changes the brain in different ways for different assaults. Domestic violence is nothing like sex trafficking in terms of the impact and the worldview and the results of how generally people respond to the abuse they've endured. If you're not educated on all of that, if you're not aware of it, you're bound to create more damage. And that's, I think, what we're talking about here is educating people, training people to stop damaging others.
Stop damaging themselves and stop damaging others in the process. It's a twofold, because damaged people damage others. So advocates will do that, or people who are not trained, case managers, and to include therapists, psychologists, or law enforcement. I'm not leaving anybody off the table.
You're right.
If we're not dialed in, that trickles down. My goal would be, God, let's just stop doing that to victims and survivors. Let's do our best to not be part of the problem. Mm-hmm. Let's be solution focused to do our best.
Yep. Nicole, let's do this again soon. I think it's been way too long since you and I have talked. And like you just said, Man, we could do multiple episodes on all these different things.
You bet. I will see about getting you that paperwork. I don't
Right.
know if my department still has the email from the organization or the board or whatever it is. It just they just mentioned it in passing, and I was like, no kidding. I mean, I didn't say the word kidding at the time, but like I've got a copy
Yeah.
of the email, like people talking to the board, and basically that's fine. I'm okay if people question my integrity, because you can call me every name in the book, question my integrity, like do whatever, because the harder you fight to personally attack me, what that tells me is that's all you got. You know you're wrong on everything else, because
Right.
that's how I find that when people do personal attacks, it's basically deception on the actual problem. But my husband uses this term all the time. He goes, I have big broad shoulders. I'm like, you know what, me too.
Yep.
So victims, survivors, like whatever, I'm here to advocate for them.
Right.
And I don't want him to be depressed by this conversation by any means, but 10 to 1, if you ran a poll of survivors, of people who listen to your podcast, and gave a definition of agency or institutional betrayal, they would probably say they've experienced that on some level.
I'm sure they would, because a lot of them have come on this show and said that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I'd love to come back again. Maybe one of these days I'm going to come back with a really epic update, like something has changed for the better, and it won't be because I don't stop trying. That is the truth.
Thank you for taking the time, like I said before, on this busy holiday weekend and sneaking in some time with sexual assault survivor stories to shed some light on what's been going on. And for those of you who may not know, also big congratulations to you on being recently married.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You bet. All right. We'll talk again soon. Thanks, Nicole.
All right. Thanks, Dave.
That does it for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. I want to extend a sincere and deeply grateful thank you to Nicole Florisi for joining us today and sharing her time, insights, and wisdom. Nicole, your contribution is truly appreciated, and we're honored to have had you on the show. Thank you for sacrificing your time, especially on such short notice and on a holiday weekend, no less. You're a true friend and an amazing guest. For my listeners, my call to action this week is for you to share Nicole's episode with everyone in your circle of influence. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platform, give the show a 5-star rating, and become a follower of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories on Instagram. All of this helps spread the message of bringing justice to victims and survivors of rape and sexual assault. Another great way to do this is to start by believing. Whenever you hear a victim of rape or sexual assault tell their story, because we all know someone whose life has been impacted by rape or sexual assault. Be sure to join me next week for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. We'll see you next week.